Hi, OralComm. This is Mr. Roman. I'm recording a lecture on persuasion and the Toulmin model today. Um, so, what you're going to want to get out before you continue to listen to this is either open up a document on your computer or get out a sheet of paper and a pen or a pencil. And you're going to want to take some notes on this because this is going to help you when you're putting together your persuasive speech. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want you to do to just kind of think about this can go somewhere in your notes, is answer the following prompt. Think about a time you have tried to convince someone to change their mind or do something for you. What was your goal, and how did you convince the other person to give you what you want? So go ahead and pause the video and just take 2 or 3 minutes to write down a brief response to this prompt. So now that you've written something down and you've restarted the video, I'll give you an example. Last summer, when my wife and I first moved in together after we got married, she really wanted some type of pet, but we didn't want to pay to have a dog or a cat in our apartment yet. And I wasn't too crazy about getting a pet, but I understood that she did. So she spent some time convincing me that we should get a fish. And so my thought was, well, okay, depending on the kind of fish, that could be pretty cheap, that could be pretty affordable. And then she started doing some research and we decided to get a betta fish. And then not only did we start to do that research to get a betta fish, but then we also decided that we needed to spend quite a bit of money to get the betta fish the luxurious lifestyle of living in a pretty big tank for a betta fish. So, what started out as oh yeah, we can get this cheap fish turned into something a little more expensive and it was one of those things where every step of the way, my wife was giving me explanations as to why she was making this decision and appealing to me in that very rational way. Um, so I was persuaded that yeah, we needed to not only get a fish, but get a big tank and these different trinkets for inside the tank for the fish and all this other stuff. So um, I'm sure all of you have had similar things where you've tried to convince your parents to give you money, you've tried to convince your friends where you should go eat lunch, etc., etc., etc. So before we even talk about what is persuasion, we need to talk or how to persuade. We need to talk about first what is persuasion. And so we're going to define persuasion as an attempt to shift an attitude, belief, or behavior of another individual. An attempt to shift an attitude, belief, or behavior of another individual. So we really have to ask ourselves, well, what does this mean, right? So let's start at the beginning. First, an attempt. Persuasion doesn't have to be successful. We want it to be successful. We want people around us to do the things that we want them to do, whatever that might be. But at the end of the day, it is still just that, an attempt. So it may take multiple times of trying to persuade our parents that we need $20, or our friends that we should go to Moe's instead of Chipotle, or whatever it might be. So that attempt piece is really important. It's also important to understand what is an attitude, what is a belief, and obviously what is a behavior. So first, let's start with belief. A belief is something that is rooted in our values and ideology. A belief is something that is rooted in our values and ideology. So beliefs are very near and dear to our heart. They're almost ingrained into like the DNA of who we are, at least the social DNA of who we are. Um, so it becomes really tricky sometimes to shift our beliefs because we've had our beliefs for our entire lives. And we might have seen small shifts here and there along the way, but at the end of the day, our beliefs are rooted in who we are. And now these can be based upon our religious beliefs. They can be based on just what we think about the world or what we're taught to think. They can be, certain characteristics, moral characteristics, or personality traits that we're taught throughout our entire lives that are important. So, for example, a characteristic that's really prioritized in the Midwest is the idea that we are we are hard workers, that you should strive to be the hardest worker out there. And that becomes a belief that that is something we want to become, while, maybe not necessarily being a hard worker, but being an efficient worker is something that would be rooted in the value and ideology of someone in some other place. So that's a belief. It's something that we hold near and dear to our hearts, rooted in our value and our ideology. We also have attitudes, and attitudes are how we feel about something. Attitudes are how we feel about something. So these are kind of like positive or negative associations, affiliations towards something, right? So, for example, maybe, for in terms of an attitude that I personally hold, um, I'm a big fan of pizza. It's one of my favorite foods, and I like a good slice of pizza. I do not like Papa John's pizza because when I was in fifth grade, I went on a trip with my family. And when I went on that trip with my family, we were on the last night before we drove home, and we were driving to and from Texas from Illinois. So it was about a 12, 13-hour trip. The night before we left, we had Papa John's pizza, and I woke up the next morning and I felt terrible. I still remember just the bad feeling I have. So every time I see Papa John's pizza, I remember that feeling. So that's the attitude. I have a negative attitude towards Papa John's pizza. And you might have negative attitudes towards any number of things. Attitudes, though, are going to be a little bit easier to shift than beliefs, because attitudes, there might be that experience with it, but there also may not be an experience with it. Maybe one time I went into a Papa John's and I had a negative interaction with an employee. That might give me a negative attitude towards Papa John's, but that's a much more short-term attitude than a long-term attitude. So beliefs are really, really hard to change. Attitudes, not so much. And then obviously behaviors are just the actions we take. Behaviors are the actions we take. So for example, let's say that you are very conscious of the environment and you want to convince people that they should recycle more. So you're going to create some type of message where you're trying to shift our behavior of, instead of just throwing everything into one garbage can and calling it a day, that we actually separate things out and have recyclables go to one place and our landfill waste go to another place. And, then we have that level of persuasion as well. So we can make those, when we're persuading, we can be attempting to shift beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors. And obviously, another individual, we're trying to make that change happen with someone else. So then the question becomes, how do we accomplish this? And that's where the Toulmin model of persuasion comes in. And so we start the Toulmin model of persuasion with a claim. And your claim is the main idea behind your argument. The main idea behind your argument. You have to tell your audience or whoever it is you're persuading what your argument is. What are you trying to persuade them to do? What attitude, what belief, what behavior are you attempting to shift? And if you can do that, then if you can articulate that, that's going to make it clear to your audience. And so there's some different types of claims that we can have in our arsenal. So the first type of claim is a claim of fact. And a claim of fact identifies whether or not something is true or false. Identifies whether something is true or false. So claims of fact can seem pretty simplistic. It's hard to argue a claim of fact sometimes because, generally speaking, it's something that we, at least hopefully, we all agree upon, right? So examples of this may seem a little out there and ridiculous, but conspiracy theory examples are good examples of claims of fact. So for example, NASA faked the moon landing. That would be a claim of fact. I can support that or I can negate that. Um, President John F. Kennedy's assassination or 9/11 was an inside job. Those would all be examples of claims of fact. Then we move on to claims of value. And claims of value identifies whether or not something is right or wrong, just or unjust, fair or unfair. Claims of value identify whether or not something is right or wrong, just or unjust, fair or unfair. And the important thing to remember here is we're really starting to tap into our values. There's usually some type of value judgment involved with a claim of value. And so there's some type of degree that comes along with that as well. So for example, Avanti's is the best Italian restaurant in Bloomington Normal would be a claim of value. Now, a couple things to think about would be the fact that you can disagree with this. Maybe you believe Biaggi's is the best Italian restaurant in Bloomington Normal. Maybe you think that Italian food is disgusting and you would rather say that another restaurant is the best restaurant or in Bloomington Normal. So, this is kind of a simplistic version of it. You can get into some more in-depth examples, maybe talking about the criminal justice system is unfair to individuals that come from minority backgrounds. That would be a claim of value where we're looking at whether something is right or wrong, or even in that case, it literally has the word unfair in the claim. And then, of course, the final type is a claim of policy. And claim of policy identifies whether something, a policy or some type of rule, should or should not be done, should or should not be implemented. And so some examples, one would be university high schools should adopt a dress code that includes uniforms. That would be a claim of policy. It's saying that university high school, an organization, a group, should be changing some type of rule, and that rule in this case is to adopt a dress code. Something that was, looking at what's gone on in the recent past, the Tobacco 21 laws that have gone through. There were people that were persuading the town and city councils of Normal and Bloomington to pass Tobacco 21, which they did, and then eventually became a statewide initiative. So that Tobacco 21, the claims that were being made there were claims of policy. So after I explain each concept, I'm going to show you an example and start to build an argument, because tomorrow you're going to be asked to build an argument on your own. So feel free to come back and refer this lecture as you're building that example tomorrow. So let's look at this. So in my, let's say this is my hypothetical outline for my speech. And so I transition into my idea. And then at this A level, I have my first claim I'm going to make, which is that technology use among teenagers should be limited to 2 hours per day. Technology use among teenagers should be limited to 2 hours per day. I would record this somewhere in your notes so you can come back and add to it. I'm going to add my evidence, my warrant, and the rest of the Toulmin model later on. So that would be good for you to leave some space after this to add to it. I also want to say that, technology use among teenagers being limited to 2 hours per day really wouldn't work right now in our work from home environment. So that's my claim. So let's go on to evidence then. And personally, I always say data or evidence. I kind of use those two interchangeably. But evidence is outside information that supports your claim. Outside information that supports your claim. And so without that outside evidence, your claim is just an assertion. You're just saying something, right? So you might be saying Tobacco 21 should become the law of the land. That's great, but if you don't have any evidence as to why that's the case, I'm not really compelled to change belief, attitude, or behavior about that. So you need something to back it up. And especially, when you're becoming credible on a specific topic, but you don't have that inherent credibility, which we'll talk a lot more next week about credibility and what all that means. If you don't have that credibility, then that's where they can become a little problematic. So you use that evidence to add some credibility to your message and your argument. And so there's some different types. Um, there's expert testimony, facts, statistics, and narrative. So I'm actually going to talk about these in inverse order. So I'm going to start with narrative. Narrative, really narrative evidence is example evidence. And what I mean by that is maybe either you have some personal experience with a topic that you can bring in, or you go find the experience of someone else and you tell their story for them, right? So this person went through this, right? Little Johnny got addicted to tobacco at the age of 16, but if to make the claim that, well, maybe if someone couldn't access it till 21, then little Johnny couldn't have gotten access to tobacco at 16. You would be using Johnny's story in that case. So you'd be using narrative evidence. You can also use statistics, right? But make sure you tell the story behind a statistic. It's really easy to look at a number, and I'll kind of show you. You'll see in my example, I actually do use a statistic. But if you use a statistic, make sure you give some context to your audience about what that statistic means. So, for example, if I said that 8 in 10 U-High students regularly don't do their homework, well, that seems pretty high. And I start to quantify it, and that's, roughly almost 500 U-High students that aren't doing their homework on a regular basis. But if I said, well, no, that's actually 8 in 10 U-High seniors said that, especially second semester seniors, okay, well, that starts to make a little more sense that, yeah, that probably are about 90 or so, or sorry, over 120 or so high school seniors at U-High that maybe aren't doing their homework all the time for every class. And so really thinking about what does the statistic mean, not only when you find it, but also when you present it. It's also really important to think about that, how to use that statistic when it seems to be a small number, right? So, for example, there are reports that the COVID-19 has a mortality rate of 1%. And there are a lot of people that are downplaying the fact that 1% sounds pretty low. But, hypothetically, if everyone in the United States got infected and there's a 1% mortality rate, then you're talking about over 300,000 American citizens that would die as a result of it. So 300,000 is quite a bit. Or sorry, yeah. So, you're talking about a huge, or sorry, it'd be over 3 million if every American got infected. So you're talking about a huge number of people that represent 1%. 1% of the American population is 3 million people, over 3 million people. So that's huge. So, be thinking about that. Facts are pretty self-explanatory. It's something that, we just accept to be a fact. The sky is blue, the grass is green, the seasons change, but in certain arguments, facts can be really powerful. And then expert testimony. Expert testimony, think about what makes someone an expert. Maybe they have some experience in their field. Maybe they've done a lot of research on a specific topic. They work in that field. They have an advanced degree. But sometimes you have to watch out for, is the expert being paid by someone to say what they're saying? That's a very real possibility. On the flip side, too, something that you have to think about is, are they an expert in the field that you're talking about? So, for example, if I might say that Michael Jordan, the former NBA star, is an expert at making a shoe for basketball players because he played basketball. He knows what needs to go into a good shoe for basketball players. However, he had a restaurant and he had a McDonald's sandwich back in the day that did not sell really well, and his restaurant was open for a while and everything, but he's not an expert on food. So his expertise was being applied to that food brand, but his testimony on it, yeah, may not be so as valuable. So just watch out for that as you're doing research. So once again, I have my transition and overall main idea, and I have my claim here, technology use should be limited to 2 hours per day. So just like in the researched informative speech, I need to bring in some evidence to back up my topic sentence, or in this case, my claim. And so I'm going to show you how I found it from this. So I'm going to go and click on this link. And as I go to this link, I find this Pew Research Center article. So some things I know Pew Research is a pretty reputable website. So I'm going to pull the date, which is August 22nd, 2018. And I also have the author here, Jing Yang. So that's that. And I'm going to scroll through this, and first of all, right at the top here, wow, 54% of teens say they spend too much time on their cell phones. That seems like a pretty compelling statistic, but I don't want to necessarily just pull something from the very top, right? I need to actually kind of go through everything so that I can make sure that I have what I need to have. So I'm going to just scroll through this. Feel free to stop this video if if you want to look at this a little more in depth. 72% of teens say they often or sometimes check for messages or notifications as soon as they wake up. Okay. 57% of parents report setting screen time restrictions for their teen. Okay, that's pretty compelling. Ooh, teens expressed mixed views about whether they spend too much time in front of screens. Well, let's scroll down here. As they look at their own lives and those of their peers, most teens see things that worry them. Roughly 9 in 10 teens view spending too much time online as a problem facing their age, including 60% who say it's a major problem. That's pretty compelling. And I can go ahead and keep reading and finding something else, but we're talking 90% of teens view spending too much time online as a problem facing everyone. So that's pretty big. So, going back to this, that's what I put in here. So I'm going to put my oral citation in. We're going to do the same thing as we did before. So Jing Jiang of Pew Research Center on August 22nd, 2018 explained that 90% of teens say that spending too much time online is a problem for their generation. In this instance, I didn't use a direct quotation, right? I paraphrased what was there. I could have used a direct quotation, but I chose to paraphrase. That decision really is left up to you of how you want to do that. Okay, so that's evidence. So just some things about using evidence. So the first thing is we're going to research just like last time. When you find your topic, you're going to do some initial research and you're going to use that as evidence. But this time, the thing I would encourage you to do is outline your claims of your speech first, because that's going to give you a little more specific research direction if you start with your claims. Know that you may have to throw out your claims. You may have to junk a claim eventually, but that's okay. And then find the part of the source that will support that claim. So remember, I was looking for, a reason as to why we need to limit teen tech use. So I found that teenagers themselves are saying, yeah, we spend too much time online. That's a major problem. And then decide if you need to directly cite, paraphrase, or summarize the source. Depending, you might find the best way it's phrased, then directly cite it. If it's just a number, if you're just pulling a statistic, paraphrase it so that you can put it into the words and articulate it the way that you want to articulate it. And then the most important thing is to record the source citation as quickly as possible, right? So record that source citation and keep that handy, because you don't want to have to go back and redo your work later. Okay, so now let's move on to, we have just two more things to talk about. So the next is warrant. And I have a reasoning here because you may have in freshman English or in sophomore writing or even in your science classes heard of claim evidence reasoning. Warrant is just another word for that level of just explaining those connections. So that's really all that this is. Evidence proves nothing on its own. Even if you think that in your mind you're making the connection happen, that doesn't mean that your audience is going to make that connection. So don't claim evidence reasoning. The warrant is what explains the connection between the evidence and the claim. Be very direct in that explanation. Make sure that it is very clear to your audience how you see the evidence connecting to your claim. And so it's really important that you are as direct as possible when you are putting that together. So once again here, I have my overall, I have my transition, right? I have my claim, I have the same evidence. So now I need to put that explanation together. That explanation may need to take a couple of sentences. So mine is, if teenagers believe they're spending too much time online, then perhaps they should limit their technology use. By limiting their technology use to 2 hours per day, teenagers can make that change. So essentially, I'm setting up that there's a reason and justification using my evidence that they spend too much time online, that as to why, yeah, we should probably limit tech use to a certain amount of time per day. So that's the reasoning. You're just explaining how this connects to this. And then finally, the thing that wouldn't be in claim evidence and reasoning is the impact. And that is the sentence or sentences that explain why the argument matters. And essentially, you're going to try to figure out a way to apply your speech, especially in a persuasive speech, beyond the scope of your speech. So essentially, you're going to, don't just think about how does your topic, affect us sitting in front of you in the room while you're delivering the speech, but instead, more holistically, what does that mean for us? How can we apply this information outside of this? So, same thing, but at the very end here, you'll see I have my impact now under lowercase Roman numeral 2. By making such a change, teenagers will be better prepared to be productive in school and reconnect face-to-face social interaction. So by making such a change, the limiting tech use to 2 hours per day, I'm saying teenagers will be better prepared to be productive in school and reconnect those face-to-face social interactions. So, at the end of the day here, what I have is the fact that I'm explaining, why this all matters. So something to think about too as you're putting together an argument. This is a simple model to put it together. For one claim, you may need multiple pieces of evidence, and that's okay. It's okay to have multiple pieces of evidence. For every piece of evidence you introduce for a single claim, you need to have a warrant for each one. You only, though, need an impact at the very end of that argument, right? So if you have two pieces of evidence, you're going to have two warrants. But you will always only have in one argument, one claim, and one impact. So the number of claims and the number of impacts are the same, and the number of pieces of evidence and the number of warrants are the same. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're putting this all together. So at this point, that's the Toulmin model of persuasion. If you do have any questions, you can feel free to contact Ms. Maney or myself, and feel free to ask us those questions. Tomorrow, you're going to have the opportunity to practice putting together your own Toulmin model stuff. So be looking in Blackboard or Google Classroom for that, and hope that you're, as much as you can at least, enjoying your time off.